Welcome to the 19th Gender Summit. I'm Laura Camfield from the School of International Development at the University of East Anglia. I'm sharing my experiences of co-organising a short course on doing gender transformative research. The key lessons that I learnt from this are the importance of considering intersectionality, time, context, and resources. Let me explain what I mean. No one's identity is singular. Gender disaggregation is an important first step, but we need to go beyond that to understand how advantage and disadvantage are created and sustained. Bevan's concept of gender age is helpful here to capture one of the most important interactions. Related to this is position in the household or the family, whether you were the oldest daughter and assuming significant household responsibilities so your younger siblings can go to school, or the new wife or daughter-in-law. Your religious, ethnic or caste group will intersect with your gender to shape your identity in ways that are not simply additive, and this will be overlaid by your class. How can we capture all this? Sampling plays an important part, as I'll discuss, but the solution is not a technical one. It's more about recognising the ways in which identities and contexts work together to shape the outcomes of different interactions, including the act of research. This requires an approach to research that's sufficiently broad and long in duration to allow these subtleties to emerge. For example, through observation in different settings, repeated interviews or the use of secondary data. I've just co-authored a paper drawing on the disciplinary records of a Ugandan market, which helpfully were in English. These show not only gendered understandings of appropriate behaviour, but also the ways in which these are shaped by class in the different departments of the market. Not only are people's identities multiple, they're also dynamically responding to and shaping their contexts. If we take change as a given, then the value of a longitudinal research approach is clear. Even where it isn't possible to collect data at multiple points or link to older data sets, respondents can still be asked to reflect on change over time. This can be collectively through group-based or participatory methods, which are often visual and creative, for example, timelines or agricultural calendars, or individually through in-depth interviews such as life histories. The purpose is to understand how things change or don't change over time. What, for example, precipitates changes in practices around child marriage or causes these changes to be rolled back? Development studies, the field in which I work, is often accused of having a short memory. For example, David Lewis's claim that we live in a perpetual present. This inability to situate phenomena or interventions in an historical time span means we're often slow to learn the lessons of the past or understand how we ended up where we are today. Having a critical historical perspective is valuable at different points in the research. For example, when reviewing literature, thinking about how the time at which the paper was written affects the validity of the statistics and the conceptual framework. It's not unusual to read a paper that talks about the current state of X or Y with reference to a paper from 2006. The historical or cultural specificity of different concepts is another reason why we encourage participants in the course to approach popular and contested terms such as empowerment with great care. How is a particular paper using this term? What does that say about their understanding of its genealogy? How does their understanding fit with your own? It may, for example, be difficult to use the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index if you disagree fundamentally with their definition of empowerment. Much of what we see as quality in research relates to how things fit together. Context is a third consideration. We spend a lot of time in the course encouraging people to articulate why they've made particular methodological choices. One of the most important is the choice of sites. We ask people to consider why they've chosen a particular site or set of sites. Can they articulate this in a way that makes sense in relation to their research question? Making sense is, of course, not an exact designation, and what makes sense varies across disciplines. For a natural science audience, it may not be necessary to explain why your study of female empowerment in agriculture selected the sites based on levels of soil salinity. Social scientists may need more information to see the relationship. The comprehensive Genovate study of gender norms and agency in agriculture found striking differences in attitudes and outcomes between adjacent villages. This shows how even small differences in location matter. Earlier, I talked about the multiple nature of people's identities and the way in which this interacts with context to shape outcomes. So once you know your context, you've selected and done some preliminary reading and research in your sites, you need to think about how you'll sample. The question underpinning this decision is, what are the important differences in gendered perceptions and experiences that you need to capture to be sure that you have a credible answer to your research question? For example, if you wanted to capture a broad cross-section of views on child marriage among Ethiopian women, and you know that attitudes are likely to be influenced by age, education and ethnicity, you would want your sample to capture this. There may be other factors you want to include as well, perhaps as a result of some initial exploratory research. Grounding the sampling frame in existing literature on the topic will give it external credibility. You might also want to go deeper because a description of existing attitudes might not be the most interesting contribution to the debate. That contribution might be a case study of somewhere where attitudes have changed radically and sustainably. Your study could then be small scale and set against an analysis of secondary data on attitudes to early marriage from the Demographic and Health Survey. I come now to the final consideration of resources. Throughout the course, we encourage participants to think about what their data will enable them to say, i.e. what claims they can make with their data that will be seen as credible. This credibility doesn't just lie in numbers. 100 focus groups aren't necessarily more powerful than 10. There's likely to be considerable redundancy in the responses, and they'll be very difficult to process and analyse. Drawing on my own experience quite early in my research career, I worked on a study of health and well-being in rural northern Thailand. Having put together what I felt was quite a plausible research design and sampling frame, my colleagues pointed out to me that I didn't have representation in all of the different age groups I was interested in looking in, and I didn't have full gender representation, I didn't have this and I didn't have that, and it wasn't stratified by religion, and so on. So from this I created an incredibly elaborate sampling frame which captured all of these differences, and yet I found when I actually had the data that the differences were not reflected in what I was hearing. There was considerable saturation. I'd not chosen the most important things to focus on, and as a result I was hearing the same stories over and over again, I think in part due to the exhaustion that the researchers were experiencing asking very similar questions to very similar sets of people. This brought home to me the message that essentially sampling needs to be a scalpel rather than a palette knife if you're going to produce something that says something very interesting. Obviously, the principles for quantitative sampling are a little bit different for qualitative. So thinking again about resources, I've talked about the importance of capturing difference, time and context in doing gendered analysis, but there is of course a further question about what you can realistically commit in terms of people and time, and how you then scale your research questions accordingly. There can be a role for a purely descriptive study where there's little evidence, and much of the current work on the social impacts of COVID-19 is demonstrating this. However, where an area is well studied, research needs to go further. This can happen in two ways. By building on what's there in terms of data and literature, a colleague of mine would often use the phrase, the understudied area of girls' education, if he felt a study was falsely claiming novelty. And by using the particular strengths of your team, for example, their knowledge of the local area and languages, their willingness to spend time in the field, and their ability to build rapport perhaps through their professional practice. The 4 lessons I've outlined of intersectionality, time, context and resources are considerations for all forms of research, not just those that aim for gender transformation. Having a systematic and well-articulated research plan, however, is particularly important in an area where resources are often harder to mobilise. There may also be structural reasons that predispose readers to doubt your conclusions. The SDGs offer an opportunity to add granularity and political sensitivity to targets that in the past have seemed abstract and remote. Supported by good quality gender transformative research, they enable us to leave no one behind in our representations, even if these are not always perfectly translated into policy. Thank you very much for your time.